My son Julian's question hung over the long mahogany table like a vulture, circling the carcass of what was left of my dignity. "So, Mom, what does it feel like to be a loser?" It wasn't a whisper, but a proclamation, polished with the same cold cruelty with which he polished his business trophies. The sound ricocheted off the crystal glasses and the faces of my teenage grandchildren, who smothered complicit giggles into their linen napkins. His wife, Amelia, offered me a smile as thin as a knife's blade, a mixture of pity and contempt that was somehow more painful than the question itself. In that instant, the sumptuous noise of the dinner, the distant clinking of cutlery in the kitchen, the low hum of the air conditioning, vanished, replaced by a sharp ringing inside my head. I felt the weight of my 75 years not in my bones, but in my soul. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night when he was a feverish baby, every meal I skipped so he could have new shoes, every prayer I offered for his success, all of it condensed into a single heavy drop of poison, now injected directly into my heart. The air in my lungs seemed to have turned to cement. I looked down at my trembling hands in my lap, the bulging veins telling the story of a life of work, of caring, of loving. These were the hands that had taught him to tie his shoes, that had applauded him at every graduation, that had given him all my savings so he could start his first company. Now, they looked like the hands of a stranger, useless and worn. The loser, the word echoed. I didn't feel anger, not at first. What I felt was a deep, icy void, the kind of emptiness that comes when the last rope of hope, which you've clung to for years on end, finally snaps. And in that deafening silence, something shifted. A frigid calm washed over me. Slowly, as if moving limbs that were not my own, I placed the silver fork and knife next to my untouched plate. The soft click of the cutlery on the porcelain sounded like a starting pistol. I smoothed the linen napkin on my lap one last time, raised my tired gaze, and met the cold, calculating eyes of my son. There was no remorse there, only the expectation of a reaction, an entertainment for his guests. With a dignity that emerged from the depths of my humiliation, I stood up, my back straightened, my shoulders, once stooped by the weight of resignation, squared. The pain in my hip was a hot ember, but my purpose was stronger. "Excuse me," I said. My voice was not a whimper nor a whisper. It was firm, low, and final. And as I turned and walked out of that opulent dining room, leaving behind the suspended sound of a ruined celebration, I knew the real loser was not me. The real poverty was not the absence of money, but the absence of love. And that night, I wasn't running away from a house. I was finally coming home to myself. The path from my bedroom door to the dining room in my son's mansion was a journey I made every night, but it never got any easier. It felt like a walk of shame, a public display of my dependence. On that particular night, the opulence seemed more aggressive than ever. The white marble floor imported from Italy was so polished it reflected the ceiling lights like a frozen lake, and my worn-out shoes, the only ones my rheumatism allowed, seemed to sully its perfection with each hesitant step. I felt like a stain, a mistake in the impeccable design of Julian's life. He had built an empire of shiny surfaces and sharp corners, and I was a reminder of a past he strived to sand down and varnish until it was unrecognizable. The dining room itself was a cathedral to the god of money. The ceiling soared to a height that made my old little apartment look like a shoebox, and a crystal chandelier, which Julian once boasted had cost more than the house he grew up in, hung over the table like a cluster of diamond tears. The mahogany table, long enough to accommodate an army, was set with military precision. Silver cutlery lined up like soldiers, crystal glasses gleaming like sentinels, and white linen napkins folded into shapes I wouldn't dare disturb. Sitting at that table was like reporting for inspection. My place was always the same, at the opposite end from Julian, as far as possible from the center of power. It was a geographical positioning that perfectly reflected my place in his life. A peripheral figure, an obligation kept at a distance. As I approached, I felt the glances, however brief, from the guests. They were glances that catalogued me in the blink of an eye. The old lady, the host's mother, the relic. I wore my best cardigan, a navy blue one I had knitted myself a decade ago, but next to the designer suits and silk dresses, it looked like a uniform of poverty. I sat down, and the weight of the heavy, ornate chair seemed to push me down, fixing me in my role as a silent spectator in the grand theater of my son's success. The air was thin and cold, no matter how hot it was. Outside in the Arizona desert, it was a cold that didn't come from the air conditioning, but from the total absence of human warmth. The other guests formed a gallery of smiling, empty faces, each reflecting the light of Julian's success in their own way. Amelia, my daughter-in-law, presided over the table beside him, a queen on her mahogany throne. Her smile to me was a work of art of falsehood, a perfect curve of the lips that didn't come close to her eyes, which scanned me with the precision of a security scanner, registering every gray hair out of place, every age spot on my hands. She exuded an expensive perfume that seemed to fill any space my silence created, a way of suffocating me without saying a single word. My grandchildren, teenagers I barely recognized, were absorbed in their phones, their faces illuminated by a bluish glow that isolated them from the real world. They were perfect products of this environment, well-dressed, well-mannered on the surface, but with an indifference that cut deeper than any insult. Occasionally, the younger one, Thomas, would look up from his device and stare at me for a second, not with affection, but with a distant curiosity, as if he were looking at an artifact in a museum. "This is grandmother," his gaze seemed to say, "the antique piece in Dad's collection." The others were business partners, men and women with loud voices and laughs that sounded like cash registers. They spoke of stocks, of mergers, of acquisitions, of trips to tax havens. It was a foreign language to me, a dialect of ambition that contained no words for compassion or sacrifice. I felt like an immigrant in my own family, trapped in a strange land with no passport and no understanding of the local customs. My alienation was a cocoon I wove around myself, a fragile protection against the pain of invisibility. Being ignored was better than being the target. So I would shrink, try to take up as little space as possible, breathe as little air as possible, hoping the night would pass quickly and I could return to the anonymous safety of my room. When the dishes arrived, brought by a silent and efficient staff, the feeling of displacement intensified. They were culinary creations that looked more like sculptures than food. Small portions of something colorful in the center of a vast white plate, surrounded by swirls of sauce and tiny leaves that seemed to have been placed with tweezers. My mind, for a moment, fled to my old kitchen, to the smell of beans cooking slowly on the stove, to the steam from a pot of beef stew that could feed a family for 2 days for the cost of one of those decorative leaves. The food I made was to fill bellies and warm souls. This food was to be admired, photographed, a statement of status. The real nourishment here was envy. Beside me, a row of silver cutlery stretched out like a minefield. Forks of different sizes, knives with strangely shaped blades, a small spoon whose purpose I couldn't guess. A cold panic rose up my spine. Which one should I use first? The uncertainty was paralyzing. I knew that any mistake, however small, would be noticed. I could feel Julian's gaze, even from the other side of the table. It was a heavy gaze, an X-ray that penetrated my facade of calm and saw the frightened peasant underneath. He didn't need to say anything. His silence was a criticism, his stillness a judgment. He delighted in my discomfort, as my inadequacy was the perfect backdrop for his brilliance. Every move I made was calculated. I picked up the outermost fork, mimicking the gesture of the woman sitting next to me, hoping I had gotten it right. The weight of the utensil in my hand was strange, cold, and excessive. It was the weight of wealth that did not belong to me, the weight of a life of which I was just a paying spectator, with the currency of my own dignity. Julian then began his show. He leaned back in his chair, a glass of red wine in hand, and began to narrate his, latest achievement, the acquisition of a small tech startup that he had crushed, as he put it, with an irresistible offer. His voice filled the room, full of a confidence that bordered on arrogance. His gestures were broad and theatrical, drawing the charts of his success in the air. I watched him, but I couldn't see the boy I had raised. That boy, with scraped knees and dreamy eyes, had disappeared. In his place was this man, a polished stranger with my son's face. A memory, sharp and painful, struck me like lightning. Julian, about 10 years old, sitting at the table in our tiny kitchen in Fresno, the yellowish light of the single bulb illuminating his notebook. He was drawing a car, a flying car. "One day, Mom," he told me with a seriousness that only children possess, "I'm going to build things that help people. I'm going to build a big house for you, where you'll never have to worry about the bills again." His eyes back then shone with the light of promise, not the cold reflection of gold. Where was that boy? What happened to that dream of helping people? He had built the big house, yes, but it was a house that imprisoned me, a monument not to love, but to his ability to erase the past. The dissonance between memory and reality was a physical pain, a tightness in my chest that made it hard to breathe. The man who boasted of crushing the competition was not the son of the woman who taught him to share his lunch with the classmate who had nothing to eat. I looked at him and saw a ghost, the ghost of the son I had lost somewhere on the way to the top. To illustrate how far he had come, Julian decided to tell a story about his childhood. He presented it as an amusing anecdote, a quaint tale of overcoming adversity. "You won't believe this," he began, and all heads turned to him. "But there was a time when I only had one pair of pants for school, and my mother here," he gestured in my direction with his wine glass, "was a magician with a needle and thread. Every weekend she would patch them up. It got to the point where the pants were more patch than original fabric." The guests laughed, a polite and condescending laugh. "Poor boy, it's a good thing you got out of that life," their smiles said. But to me, that story wasn't funny. I remember those pants. I remember the feel of the worn fabric under my fingers, my worry that the other boys would make fun of him. I remember staying up late under the dim light, carefully sewing each patch to make it look as discreet as possible, putting not just thread, but all my love and hope into every stitch. It was an act of desperation and devotion. And now, he was serving it up as dinner entertainment, stripping it of all its meaning, turning my sacrifice into a punchline to impress his rich friends. I felt the blood rush to my face, a heat of humiliation that spread down my neck. I wanted to scream, "It wasn't like that. It was about love. It was about survival." But my voice was stuck in my throat. I just forced a weak smile, a nod, playing my part in the play. I was the stepping stone he used to climb, and now he was proudly displaying it, not caring about the marks of his feet on me. That was the first wound of the night, a clean, deep cut, inflicted publicly for the applause of the audience. Amelia, seeing an opportunity to reinforce the narrative, stepped in. She leaned towards me, her diamond necklace sparkling and blinding me for a moment, and placed her hand on my arm. Her touch was cold. "Clara, you must feel so incredibly proud and amazed by all of this, don't you?" she asked, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "To come from that life and now be here. It must be like a fairy tale for you, really." The question was a trap, coded in false concern. If I said yes, I would confirm their view of me, the peasant dazzled by royalty, validating the superiority of their world. If I said no, I would be the ungrateful one, the bitter old woman who didn't appreciate their generosity. It was a subtle but perfectly executed humiliation. She wasn't including me in the conversation. She was using me as an accessory to highlight the grandeur of their lives. Fairy tale. The word sounded absurd. In fairy tales, there was love, there was kindness. Here, there were transactions. I wasn't in a castle. I was in a gilded cage, and the bars were made of condescension. My response was the usual one, a retreat into myself. I lowered my head and murmured "Yes, it's very beautiful," knowing my words were insufficient, but they were the only ones I was allowed to use. What I wanted to say was, I'm proud of the boy you were, Julian. I'm amazed by your ability to forget. And this isn't a fairy tale, Amelia. It's a well-decorated tragedy. But those words would die with me, locked in the vault of my heart. My silent agreement satisfied them. They smiled, pleased to have put the museum piece back on its shelf, and the conversation moved on, leaving me behind in the wake of their indifference. The anxiety began to manifest physically. A fine tremor started in my hands, and I quickly hid them under the table, clasping them together in my lap. It was a futile attempt to control the uncontrollable, to hide the evidence of my weakness. My heart beat irregularly against my ribs, like a trapped bird trying to escape. A sudden dryness took over my mouth, and swallowing became a conscious and difficult task. I picked up my water glass with a hand that seemed not to obey me, fearing the tremor would make it clink against my teeth and attract the attention I was trying so hard to avoid. The dining room, with its high walls and sumptuous decor, suddenly seemed to be shrinking around me. The loud voices and laughter of the guests became an indistinct and oppressive hum. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of wealth and indifference. The desire to be invisible was so strong it was almost a physical pain. I wanted to be able to shrink, to fold, in on myself until I became nothing more than a dot, a particle of dust that could be swept under the Persian rug and forgotten forever. Every minute dragged on like an hour. I focused on small things to anchor myself, the intricate pattern on the handle of my fork, the way the light fragmented through the crystal of my glass, the feel of the fabric of my cardigan against my skin. They were small life rafts in an ocean of panic. I was trapped by my dependence, by my age, by my withered love for a son who no longer existed. The mansion was not a home. It was an elegant prison, and that dinner was not a celebration. It was my judgment. The conversation inevitably turned to the future, a future of which I was clearly not a part. Julian spoke enthusiastically about buying a summer house in Aspen, about a month-long trip through Europe next fall, about expanding his business to Asia. Amelia discussed plans for a major renovation of the west wing of the mansion, to build a new gym and a home theater. They talked about their children going to Ivy League universities, about setting up trust funds to secure the future of their yet-to-be-born grandchildren. It was a bright, expansive, and expensive future. And in all these plans, in all these projections of happiness and success, my name was never mentioned. There was no, let's take Mom to see the mountains, or we need to make sure Grandma's room is comfortable during the renovation. My existence was a footnote in their present and completely absent from their future. The realization landed on me not with a shock, but with the cold resignation of a long-suspected truth. I was not a person in their lives. I was an item in their budget, a liability to be managed. My purpose, in their eyes, had already been fulfilled. I raised him. Now, I was a remnant, a burden he carried out of a distorted sense of duty, or, more likely, to keep up appearances. Living under his roof was not an act of love. It was a damage control strategy, a way to ensure the old mother didn't tarnish his public image. I was the old furniture that came with the property that was his life story, and he was just waiting for me to wear out until I finally broke. The second humiliation of the night came from one of the guests, a red-faced man with a gold watch who asked, in a tone that was meant to be friendly, "So, Clara, what does a lady do to keep busy in a magnificent house like this all day?" The question was innocent on the surface, but in the context of that table, it sounded like an accusation. Before I could formulate an answer, to talk about my books, about the small patch of tomatoes I tried to maintain out back, about the letters I wrote to my only living friend, Julian intervened. He let out a short, dry laugh, a laugh that had no joy in it. "Ah, my mother is our resident ghost," he said, addressing the man, but with his eyes sweeping the table to make sure everyone was listening. "She floats around, reminding us of the simple life. She's our touch of rustic authenticity." The word ghost hit me. It was exactly how I felt. Invisible, ethereal, a presence that barely registered in the world of the living. And rustic authenticity was just a polished way of calling me primitive, of framing me as a decorative object. He had stolen my voice once again, defining my existence for me, for others, reducing my entire life to a punchline, a prop on his stage. The guests smiled. They understood the dynamic. It was the story of the self-made man who kept a reminder of his humble origins nearby to make his success even more impressive. I was the before, in the before and after picture of his life. The pain was sharp, but silent. I just smiled, a spasm of the lips, and looked down at my plate, wishing the floor would open up and swallow me whole. The night was coming to an end, and the air was thick with the smell of expensive wine and self-satisfaction. Julian's laughter was the dominant sound, the confident baritone of a man who was the king of his universe. He leaned back in his chair, the epitome of success, absorbing the adoration of his guests like the desert absorbs the rare rain. His eyes scanned the table, landing on each of his partners, on his perfectly manicured wife, on his children who were extensions of his own legacy. It was a look of possession, of a man assessing his assets. And then his gaze met mine, at the other end of the table. In that moment, a subtle change occurred in his expression. The satisfied smile faltered and was replaced by something else. It was a flash of, what? Irritation? Contempt? It was the look of a perfectionist who finds a single flaw in his masterpiece. I was the flaw. I, with my frayed cardigan, my trembling hands, and my silence that was not of admiration, but of pain. I was the counterpoint to everything he had become, a mirror that reflected an image he hated. I reminded him of where he came from, and he couldn't stand it. I saw the idea form in his eyes, a spark of calculated cruelty. He straightened up, cleared his throat, and the noise in the room subsided, as if everyone sensed that the final act of the show was about to begin. He wanted to cement his victory, to erase the last stain. He wanted to use me one last time that night, to prove to himself and to everyone how powerful he was. So powerful that he could crush the very woman who gave him life. A heavy silence fell over the table. Julian looked directly at me, a sneer beginning to form on his lips. He opened his mouth to speak, and I held my breath, knowing that whatever came next, it would be the final straw. To understand the depth of the wound that Julian's question opened, one must go back in time, to a small house in a dusty neighborhood in Fresno, California. Life, back then, was a daily battle. After my husband, Robert, passed away, leaving me with a 5-year-old boy and a mountain of debt, the world shrank and came down to a single word: survival. I was a nurse, a job I loved, but one that demanded everything from me. I worked double shifts at the county hospital, the smell of antiseptic embedded in my hair and clothes. I remember the exhaustion that weighed on my bones like lead, the constant pain in my feet after 12 hours of running through the hallways. But that exhaustion would vanish the moment I walked through the door and saw Julian's face. He was my why, my purpose. Everything was for him. Every dollar I saved, every meal I skipped to ensure he had enough, every moment of rest I sacrificed to help him with his homework, was an investment in his future. Our house was tiny, with paper-thin walls and a heater that insisted on failing in the middle of winter. But I filled it with love. The smell of homemade bread, the sound of my laughter as we played in the small yard, the sight of his drawings tacked to the refrigerator. These were our riches. I remember one night in particular, a fierce storm was raging outside, and the power went out. Julian was scared, so I lit a candle, and we sat in the living room making animal shadows on the wall. He would laugh, a pure, crystalline laugh that was the most beautiful music in the world. In that moment, in that small bubble of light and warmth, we had everything. I wasn't building a fortune. I was building a man. And I believed, with all my soul, that the foundation of love and sacrifice I was laying was unbreakable. Julian, as a boy, was my sunshine. He had his father's curious mind and my compassionate heart. He was a gentle boy, who once cried because he accidentally stepped on an ant. He would bring me wildflowers he picked on his way home from school, his little dirt-stained hands extending them to me as if they were the rarest of bouquets. "For you, Mom," he'd say, "because you're the best mom in the world." And my heart would swell with a pride so vast it felt like it would burst. In the kitchen, he was my official helper, climbing on a by stool to stir the cake batter, invariably spilling more flour on the floor than in the bowl. We would laugh together, covered in white, accomplices in our happy little mess. His brilliance in school was evident from an early age. He devoured books, asked questions that stumped me, and brought home report cards with grades that filled my eyes with tears of joy. I framed his first A+ in science and hung it on the living room wall as if it were a priceless work of art. I told everyone about him, my colleagues at the hospital, the lady at the grocery store checkout, our neighbors. "My Julian is going to be somebody," I'd say, not as a hope, but as a certainty. He was the living proof that my sacrifices were worth it, the personification of all my dreams. He promised he would take care of me, that he would buy me a house with a big garden, and that we would never have to worry again. And I believed him, because back then, his heart was as pure and his intentions as clear as the morning. Light. He wasn't just my son. He was my best friend, my confidant, my legacy. The first crack in our foundation appeared when Julian went to college. He won a scholarship to a prestigious university on the East Coast, an achievement we celebrated like a lottery win. To supplement it, I took out loans, worked every extra shift I could get, ensuring he wouldn't feel the weight of our poverty amidst his wealthy classmates. At first, the calls were daily, filled with excitement about classes and new friends. But slowly, the frequency decreased. The conversations became shorter, more rushed. When he came home for the first Thanksgiving break, something had changed. He looked at our small house with a different gaze, a gaze that held a hint of shame. The food I had prepared with so much love, his favorite dishes, he called heavy food. One day, he brought a college friend home without warning, a young man named David, who wore clothes that probably cost more than my monthly salary. I made coffee and served my best cookies on our best china. While I was in the kitchen, I heard Julian say to David with a forced laugh, "It's all very quaint, isn't it?" My mom is old school. The word quaint hit me. It wasn't a compliment. It was a way of putting us, me and our home, in a little box of something old, peculiar, and ultimately inferior. It was the first time I felt he was distancing himself from me, not just in miles, but in spirit. He was learning a new language, the language of status and appearance. And in this new language, I and my simple love were becoming obsolete. That was the first bitter taste of humiliation. Subtle, but unmistakable. Julian's transformation accelerated dramatically when Amelia entered his life. He met her at his first job in an investment firm, and from the first time he brought her home, I knew. Amelia was like a creature from another planet. Tall, slender, with clothes that seemed to have been sewn onto her body and an air of superiority. That preceded her. She looked at my apartment, at my modest furniture, and at me with a smile that was an exercise in restraint. I saw in her eyes that she was calculating, measuring, assessing how big of a problem I would be. She spoke of brands, places, and people I had never heard of, and made a point of highlighting the distance between her world and mine. I remember trying to make conversation, asking about her family. "They have a winter home in Palm Beach," she replied, and the subject died there, making it clear we had no common ground. She was the architect of Julian's new identity. She taught him to despise his origins, to see his past not as a source of strength, but as a stain to be removed. Under her influence, he changed his clothes, his friends, and finally, his values. The boy who dreamed of helping people now dreamed of stock options and year-end bonuses. Amelia didn't love him. She curated him, molding him to fit her vision of a powerful partner. And part of that, curation involved pushing me to the margins, turning me into an anomaly, an embarrassing footnote in the success story they were writing together. The second moment of humiliation was brutal and direct, delivered without the subtlety of before. It happened a few years later, when the building where I lived in Fresno was sold to a developer, and all the tenants received an eviction notice. Panic seized me. I was already retired, living on a small pension and my savings, and the rental market had, skyrocketed. I called Julian, my voice trembling, explaining the situation. He sighed on the phone, a heavy sigh of impatience. "I'll take care of it, Mom," he said, in the tone of someone dealing with an annoying problem. The following weekend, he and Amelia came to visit me to discuss the options. Sitting in my small living room, they spread apartment listings on my coffee table. They were all expensive, far beyond what I could afford. The tension in the room was palpable. I felt like a child being scolded. At one point, Amelia commented, "Maybe something smaller, more manageable?" The subtext was clear. Finally, Julian's frustration boiled over. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I knew since he was a boy, but which now signaled anger, not confusion. "I just don't know where we're going to get the money for this right now, with the investment in the new house and everything," he said, more to Amelia than to me. He turned to me, his face a mask of resentment. "Honestly, Mom, sometimes it feels like you're just an extra mouth to feed, an anchor holding me back." The word anchor sucked all the air out of the room. I looked at him, at my boy, and I saw a stranger. The woman who had worked to the bone so he would never go hungry was being called an extra mouth. The love I had poured over him was being redefined as a weight. In that moment, I didn't cry. I shut down. A steel door came down over my heart. It was the only way to survive the pain. My health, perhaps sensing the coldness that had settled into my life, began to decline. The arthritis in my hands worsened, and a stubborn rheumatism settled in my hips, making every step a negotiation with pain. Living alone became unsustainable. It was then that Julian, probably advised by Amelia on the optics of the situation, made the decision to move me into their mansion in Scottsdale. On the surface, it seemed like an act of filial generosity. His friends and colleagues certainly saw it that way, the successful son taking care of his elderly mother. But I knew the truth. It was not an invitation. It was a summons. The move was like a funeral for my independence. I watched strangers pack my life into boxes, each object a piece of my identity being sealed away. My small apartment, which had witnessed so many struggles and joys, was emptied until it became an anonymous shell. Arriving at the mansion was like landing on an alien planet. I was shown to a guest room that was larger than my old living room, but completely impersonal. It had expensive furniture and a view of a perfectly manicured garden, but it had no soul. It didn't have my photos, my piled-up books, my worn-out armchair. My life was reduced to 2 suitcases. The loneliness in that place was a living being, vast and suffocating. I spent my days in the silence of my room, listening to the distant sounds of a family living a life I was not a part of. The transition was not a rescue. It was a gilded exile, a way to keep me contained, managed, and above all, out of the way. Life in the mansion settled into a routine of invisibility. I was, as Julian had said, a ghost. I floated through the silent corridors, careful not to touch anything, not to leave any marks. The staff of servants, under Amelia's strict orders, were polite but impersonal. They brought me my meals on a tray, asked if I needed anything with a cold efficiency that discouraged any real conversation. They were not hostile. They simply treated me as part of the furniture, something to be cleaned and maintained. Amelia ignored me most of the time. Our encounters were brief and formal, usually in the hallway. "Good morning, Clara," she would say, without slowing her pace, her eyes already focused on her next appointment. The grandchildren were strangers who shared my blood. They lived in a world of iPads, private tutors, and social engagements of which I had no knowledge. I was the grandmother who lived at the end of the hall, a figure they saw as often as the gardener. There was one time when, overcome by a wave of nostalgia and a desperate need for connection, I went to the kitchen. The smell of garlic and herbs reminded me of my own home. I thought of offering to help, perhaps to teach the chef Robert's stew recipe, which Julian loved so much as a child. The chef, a Frenchman with an imposing mustache, looked at me with alarm as I entered his domain. "Madame, please," he said, almost pushing me out. "You don't need to worry. Everything is under control." I was not needed. My skills, my knowledge, my love, expressed through food, all of it was useless here. I was a deposed queen living in the usurper's palace, and my only power was that of not being a bother. My most acute external conflict manifested in my doctor's visits. Julian, of course, never had time to take me. He would send a driver, a silent man who never spoke, in a luxury car with tinted windows that isolated me from the world outside. Being dropped off at the door of a large impersonal clinic was a terrifying experience. I, who had spent my whole life in hospitals as a nurse, now felt completely lost and helpless on the other side of the desk. I had to deal with the bureaucracy alone. Endless forms with tiny print that my tired eyes could barely focus on, impatient receptionists who spoke too fast, and computer systems I didn't understand. I would sit in the waiting room for hours, surrounded by strangers, feeling my loneliness, like a physical illness. The doctor, a young man with a rushed air, would flip through my chart on his tablet, barely making eye contact. He spoke to me in medical jargon that he didn't bother to translate, treating me more like a set of symptoms than a human being. "We'll increase the dose of this, decrease that," he'd say, already getting up to leave. Julian paid for everything, the best insurance, the best specialists, but he provided the money, not the care. He outsourced his filial responsibility. He wasn't there to hold my hand, to help me understand the diagnosis, to comfort me. He was in a meeting, closing a deal, building his empire, while I faced the fragility of my body and the fear of mortality all alone in a sterile examination room. It was abandonment in its most modern and efficient form. In the midst of this vastness of loneliness, I had a single lifeline: Maria's letters. Maria had been my colleague at the Fresno hospital for over 30 years, and my dearest friend. She was the only person who knew the Clara from before, the vibrant woman behind the resident ghost facade. Our letters were my only link to the life I had lost. We exchanged news about old friends, recipes, neighborhood gossip, and most importantly, we shared the truths of our hearts. Her round, familiar handwriting on an envelope was the highlight of my month. I would eagerly wait for the mailman to pass, and when I saw an envelope with a Fresno postmark, my heart would leap. I would take the letter to my room and read it slowly, savoring every word, rereading it several times over the following days. It was a reminder that I still existed, that someone in the world cared about me, that the woman I was had not been completely erased. One day, a particularly thick envelope arrived. I recognized it immediately. It was Maria's handwriting. I felt the usual wave of joy and anticipation as I took it to my sanctuary. I sat in the armchair by the window, the only piece of furniture I had insisted on bringing from my apartment, and carefully opened the seal. Maria's letter was longer than usual, and her tone, from the very first lines, was different. It wasn't the usual light-hearted chatter. There was an urgency in her words. Maria's letter began as usual, with questions about my health and good-humored complaints about the weather. But then the tone shifted. She wrote that she was helping the daughter of an old friend of ours, who had passed away, clean out his house. This friend, Mr. Henderson, had been an employee at the city clerk's office for 50 years. While they were emptying an old filing cabinet in his garage, they found a box of old documents, files that should have been discarded decades ago, but that old Henderson, a notorious hoarder, had kept. In the midst of dusty deeds and certificates, Maria found something that made her stop. It was a folder with my late husband's name, Robert, on it. She wrote that, out of curiosity, she opened it. Inside, there were documents related to the small plot of land Robert and I had bought when we got married, the land where we built our first little house. They were survey papers and property records from the 1950s. At the back of the folder, There was a correspondence between the clerk's office and a large oil company of the time, along with an internal memo that seemed to have been filed by mistake. My heart started to beat faster as I read Maria's description. She didn't understand all the technical details, but one sentence in the memo had shocked her, and she transcribed it for me in the letter. My hands were trembling so much that the words danced on the page. I read the sentence once, twice, 3 times, and the air seemed to be sucked out of my lungs, leaving a cold vacuum. In that envelope, on that sheet of yellowed paper, was a truth about our first piece of land, a truth that my beloved Robert had apparently never known, or perhaps had known and hidden to protect me from disappointment. A truth that, if it was what I thought it was, would not just change my financial situation, it would change absolutely everything. I read the sentence in Maria's letter over and over, the words jumbling and realigning before my eyes. The memo suggests that initial prospecting indicated significant mineral deposits under the entire subdivision, but the information was classified as non-actionable to avoid inflating land acquisition costs. Mineral deposits? The words sounded, as if they belonged to another language, another world, our land. The small patch of dry land in Fresno that Robert had bought with a lifetime's savings from manual labor. We had sold it for next to nothing to a developer who built dozens of identical little houses, including ours. I had always thought of that land as a symbol of our humble beginnings, almost a misjudgment by a good but naive man. I believed we had been poor because that was our lot, our place in the world. But that memo suggested something else. It suggested that we were not just poor, perhaps we had been deceived. The idea was so monumental, so seismic, that my brain struggled to process it. I, Clara, the widow, the retired nurse, the mother who was a burden, could own something more than the clothes in my closet and the memories in my heart. A tremor ran through my body, but it was not the tremor of anxiety or weakness. It was something different. It was the tremor of a dormant mountain, feeling the first vibrations of a volcano about to awaken. I looked around my luxurious, sterile room, the gilded cage. For years I had accepted this prison as an act of charity, a reluctant kindness. But what if the key to my own freedom lay buried under decades of dust and lies, waiting to be found? Maria's letter was not just a piece of paper. It was a map, an escape route. In the stillness of that room, something fundamental broke inside me. It was the shell of resignation I had cultivated for so long. The eye. Humiliation I felt didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It was no longer my shame. It became their shame. The shame of a system that hides the truth from the little people. The shame of a son who measures his mother's worth in dollars and cents. Julian's question, "What does it feel like to be a loser?" came back to my mind. But this time, it didn't hurt me. Instead, it lit a flame. A cold, calm fury began to burn in my chest. A loser? I had survived widowhood, raised a son alone with my own. 2 hands, faced poverty with my head held high, and loved unconditionally, even when that love was not returned. I was not a loser. I was a survivor. And now I had more than survival in mind. I wanted justice, not the noisy justice of the courts or the revenge that poisons the soul. I wanted the quiet, personal justice of reclaiming my dignity. The discovery about the land did more than give me hope for financial independence. It rewrote my past. My husband had not been a fool. Our sacrifices were not the result of failure. They were the result of our integrity in a world that lacked it. Suddenly, I was no longer the frail old lady in the guest room. I was the guardian of a secret, the heir to a truth. And that truth gave me a strength I hadn't felt in decades. The woman who had become a ghost was beginning to remember what it was like to have flesh and bone. The decision was made not with words, but with a change in my posture. I straightened my back, took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the firm ground beneath my feet. The first step was to confirm. A letter from a friend was a spark, but I needed concrete proof. The obstacle was immense: technology. My world was made of paper books and knitting needles. Julian's world was made of screens and algorithms. In my room, there was a computer that the family occasionally used, a sleek, intimidating object that I had never dared to touch. But necessity is a powerful teacher. That night, after the whole house was plunged into silence, I sat before the glowing screen. My hands, deformed by arthritis, trembled over the keyboard. I felt like an explorer in unknown territory. The first attempts were frustrating. I typed the search terms slowly, letter by letter. Fresno County Property Records 1950s. Mineral Rights California Old Law. The results were an ocean of legal jargon and confusing links. But the nurse in me, the woman who could find a difficult vein in the dark, did not give up. I was meticulous. I started taking notes in a notebook, just as I did with medical prescriptions. I created a list of terms, of county archive websites, of genealogy forums where people discussed old land titles. I spent hours, night after night, my eyes burning under the artificial light, learning a new craft. It was a silent battle waged in the dead of night, my own secret resistance. Every small success, finding an old map of the subdivision, downloading a digital copy of a zoning law from the Bay Era, was a small victory that fueled my determination. I was using the tools of my son's world to dismantle the prison he had built around me. Confirmation came in the early hours of the morning, almost a week later. I had found a digitized database of a local Fresno newspaper, and after hours of searching, I found it. A small article from 1958 talking about the residential expansion in our area. And at the end of the article, a passing mention of the Pacific Ore Company having completed its geological surveys in the region, releasing the lands for civil development, but retaining the subsurface exploration rights for the future. The key was there. The construction company that bought our land never owned the rights to what was underneath. And, as I discovered in an obscure law article I found later, if those rights were never formally sold or transferred, they remained with the original surface owner or their heirs. Me, the air caught in my lungs. There it was, in digital black and white. It was not a fantasy, not a dream. It was a legal fact, buried under 60 years of history. I felt a wave of dizziness, and I had to hold onto the desk to keep from falling. It wasn't a shout of eureka. It was a moment of deep, overwhelming silence. The weight of decades of feeling small, powerless, and wrong began to lift from my shoulders. It was as if a younger version of me, the strong, capable woman I used to be, was looking at me through the computer screen, nodding and saying, "I knew it. The truth would not just set me free, it would redefine me." The tremor in my hands was no longer from anxiety. It was the hum of a long-dormant energy, a power that was coming home. With the proof in hand, the next question was, what to do? The first image that came to mind was Julian's face. The instinct forged by a lifetime of dependence was to run to him, show him the papers, ask for his help in navigating the complex legal world that would open up. He, with his lawyers and his business acumen, could turn this into a fortune. But then, the image of his face at the Thanksgiving dinner came to mind, the contempt in his eyes, the cruelty in his smile, and I knew that asking for his help would be falling into the same trap. I would become just another of his projects, another asset to be managed, and in the end, he would take the credit. He would give me a bigger cage, perhaps gilded with diamonds, but a cage nonetheless. Revenge also seemed empty. To sue the company, become rich, and rub it in their faces? That would make me like them. Someone whose worth is defined by their bank balance. No. My goal was not money. It was dignity. My plan began to form, not as a business strategy, but as the final act of a play about motherhood. I would not confront Julian to ask for help. I would confront him to say goodbye, to have the final, honest conversation we never had, to break, once and for all, the cycle of humiliation and dependence. I would use this truth not as a weapon to attack him, but as a shield to protect myself and a key to open my own door. I would prepare myself, gather my documents, and then, in my own time, on my own terms, I would end my role as the resident ghost of that house. I chose the battlefield carefully. It would not be at the dinner table, a public stage. It would be in his private sanctuary, the place where he wielded his absolute power, his home office. It was a room I rarely entered, a cold, minimalist space dominated by a huge dark wood and glass desk with a view of the desert. I waited until the afternoon of the next day, a time when I knew he would be between conference calls. I walked down the hall, and my steps on the marble were no longer hesitant. They were firm, each one marking the end of an era. I stopped in front of the massive door, and instead of my usual timid tap, I knocked with my knuckles, a clear, sharp sound. "Come in," his voice sounded, laden with impatience. I opened the door and walked in. He looked up from his screen, and the surprise on his face was quickly replaced by irritation. "Mom, I'm in the middle of something important." "What is it? Do you need something?" The old Clara would have apologized and retreated. The new Clara stood her ground. "Yes, Julian," I said, my voice calm and level. "I do need something. I need 5 minutes of your time." My posture, my refusal to be dismissed, threw him off balance. He frowned, leaned back in his $1,000,000 leather chair, and gestured for me to continue, the king granting an audience to an annoying subject. I did not take the chair he indicated. I remained standing, on the other side of the vast expanse of his desk. I wanted us to be on different levels, so he would have to look up to see me. I let the silence stretch for a moment, feeling the power in it. Then, I began, not with the land, but with the wound. "The other night, at dinner, you asked me what it feels like to be a loser," I said. The words hung in the cold, conditioned air between us. He looked away, uncomfortable. "Oh, Mom, for God's sake, it was a joke. You take everything so seriously. Don't be dramatic." The contempt in his voice was the same as always, but this time, it didn't hit me. It was like an arrow trying to pierce steel. "No, Julian," I replied, my voice never wavering. "It wasn't a joke. It was the most honest thing you've said to me in years. It was your truth about me. And the saddest part is that I believed it for a very, very long time. I accepted the role you gave me, the old lady, the burden, the loser." I paused, letting my words sink into his armor of indifference. "But I've been thinking about it, and I've come to a conclusion. You were wrong." It was then that I opened the folder I had brought with me and took out the copies of the documents I had printed, the original deed, the newspaper article, the excerpt from the mineral rights law. I slid them smoothly across the glass surface of his desk. They landed between his state-of-the-art keyboard and his constantly blinking cell phone. He looked at the papers and then at me, confused. "What is this?" he asked. "This," I said, "is proof that the loser is, in fact, the legal heir to the mineral rights of a piece of land that an oil company desperately wanted 60 years ago. A piece of land that your father and I owned." I explained to him, concisely and factually, what I had discovered. Without emotion, without triumph. Just the facts. I watched him process the information. I saw the confusion in his eyes turn to disbelief, and then, quickly, the businessman's mind took over. I saw the calculator switch on behind his eyes. He picked up the papers, reading them quickly, his breath quickening. Is this real? Mineral rights? Do you know what this could be worth today? Mom, we could be rich. Richer than I ever dreamed. We can sue this company. We can—" He stopped, his face flushed with excitement. He was looking at me, but he didn't see his mother. He saw a winning lottery ticket. He saw a new business deal. His "we" was the final knife, the final proof that he would never understand. I looked at my son, the man who had everything and yet was the poorest person I knew, and I felt a wave, not of anger, but of a deep, overwhelming sadness. It was the sadness of a final grief. The boy I had raised was well and truly dead. "There is no we, Julian," I said, and my voice was the sound of a door closing. "Forever. Not anymore. For 20 years, I've been an item on your expense list, a dusty relic you kept around to ease your conscience. You didn't want a mother. You wanted a ghost. And now that this ghost might make you money, Suddenly there's a we? He stared at me, shocked, speechless for the first time in his life. I don't want your money, Julian. I don't want your help. I don't want to get into another one of your deals. All I ever wanted was my son, and I lost him somewhere on the way to this huge, empty house. The real question, Julian, the one you should be asking yourself every night, is not what it feels like to be a loser. It's what it feels like to have absolutely everything, and yet have nothing at all. I let the question hang in the room, a truth so large and so heavy it seemed to suck all the oxygen out. I turned and walked towards the door. Every step was light. I had laid down my burden. I had left it on his desk, amidst his $1,000,000 papers and his empty wealth. I heard him call my name, just once. His voice strange, broken, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I walked back down the hallway, past the expensive artworks and designer furniture, and none of it intimidated me anymore. They were just things, dead things in a dead house. I entered my room and closed the door softly behind me. The peace that flooded me was the peace of finality, the calm that comes after the longest storm. I hadn't won a fortune in that office. I had won back my soul. I sat in my armchair and looked out the window, but I didn't see the perfectly manicured garden. I saw the future, a future that, for the first time in decades, would be written by me. He thought the battle was over. Little did he know, I was just getting started. And the next morning, what I did would leave everyone, especially him, speechless. Are you enjoying this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now let's continue with the video. The next morning, the Arizona sun had barely begun to paint the sky orange and I was already on my feet. There was no rush in my movements, just a calm determination. I opened the small suitcase I kept in the back of my closet, the same one I had used to move into that house. I didn't fill it with the designer clothes Amelia occasionally gave me out of pity and which I never wore. Instead, I carefully folded my woolen cardigans, the dress I wore to my first grandson's baptism, and the few clothes that still felt like mine. I placed the faded photo of Robert, the small porcelain angel he gave me on our first wedding anniversary, Maria's letters, and on top of everything, the plastic folder containing my research and the documents. It was my entire life, the essence of it, contained in a single piece of luggage. I didn't write a note. My silence, for so many years a weapon used against me, would be my final statement. I went down the marble stairs, my shoes making a soft, definitive sound. One of the maids who was cleaning the entrance hall looked at me with the suitcase in my hand, her eyes widening in shock. She opened her mouth to say something, but I just gave her a small smile and a nod. It was a farewell smile, not for her, but for the house, for the life I was leaving behind. I had already called a taxi the night before, using the tablet for another act of silent rebellion. It was waiting for me at the end of the long driveway. I walked under the lightening sky, breathed in the fresh desert air, and when I got into the car, I didn't look back. The mansion, with all its grandeur and coldness, shrank in the rearview mirror until it disappeared, and I felt nothing but relief. I asked the taxi driver to take me to a simple, clean hotel in downtown Scottsdale. It wasn't a luxury resort, just an anonymous, functional place. At the reception desk, when the young woman asked for a credit card, I held out my hand with my own debit card, linked to my modest pension account, the act of paying for my own. Lodging, however small, was one of the most gratifying moments of my life. I felt a wave of power, an autonomy I hadn't experienced in years. The room was small, with a double bed, a small desk, and a window overlooking a parking lot. Compared to the opulence of my room in the mansion, it was almost a closet. But to me, it was a kingdom. It was mine. I could lock the door. I could walk barefoot on the carpet. I could leave my things scattered without fear of judgment. It was a sanctuary of freedom. I spent the first hour just sitting on the edge of the bed, in the silence, savoring the feeling of being in control. Then I picked up my notebook, where I had jotted down names and numbers during my late-night research. I found the number I was looking for, a small, non-profit law firm specializing in helping seniors with legal issues. I took a deep breath, and with fingers still a little shaky, but firm, I dialed the number. Each ring of the phone was a knock on the door of my new future. I was no longer waiting for someone to save me. I was orchestrating my own rescue. The news of my departure hit the mansion not like a wave of concern, but like an earthquake of fury. Julian, upon discovering my empty room and untouched bed, did not call the hospitals or the police. His first reaction, as the maid who saw me leave would later tell me, was one of pure narcissistic rage. He marched through the house like a general whose army had deserted, his face red with anger. "How dare she?" he shouted at Amelia. "After everything I've done for her. Is she trying to embarrass me? To sabotage me?" His mind, unable to process emotions like grief or fear of loss, immediately translated my act of liberation into a business strategy against him. He was convinced that I had run away to ally myself with a rival lawyer to steal his deal with the mineral rights. He didn't see a wounded mother seeking dignity. He saw a valuable asset that had slipped from his control. Amelia, in turn, fueled his fire with her own contempt. "I always said she was dramatic, Julian. She's making a scene to get attention, that's all. An ungrateful old woman. Let her be, she'll come crawling back when her pension money runs out." Their conversation, centered on control, money, and image, was the final proof that I had made the right decision. They were not mourning my absence. They were annoyed by the inconvenience it caused to their perfectly laid plans. The poverty of their souls was vaster and more arid than any desert. My meeting with the lawyer was in a modest office in an old building that smelled of paper and strong coffee. The lawyer, a young man named David, had a kind face and tired but attentive eyes. At first, I could see the skepticism on his face as I, an elderly lady with a plastic folder, unfolded my story. He probably expected another case of a family dispute or a problem with Social Security. But as I presented my research, my meticulous notes, the copies of the documents and the law articles, his expression changed. Skepticism gave way to surprise, and then to genuine respect. He listened intently, asking intelligent questions, impressed by the clarity and logic of my investigation. "Mrs. Ramos," he said at the end, "this is impressive. You've done the work of a paralegal here." For the first time in a long time, I felt a blush of pride, not shame. We discussed the strategy. I made my objective clear. "I don't want a media circus, Mr. Chen. I don't want to destroy anyone. I want what is mine by right, quietly and with dignity." He agreed. The plan would not be a bombshell lawsuit, but a calculated approach. A formal, well-documented letter of inquiry to the legal department of the oil company, outlining our claim and the evidence supporting it. It was an approach that reflected my new philosophy. True strength does not shout. It acts with silent precision. As I left his office, I felt lighter, as if I had transferred the weight of the fight to capable shoulders while still holding the helm. As I took my first steps towards justice, Julian's world began to feel the tremors of its own unstable foundation. He tried desperately to find me, not out of concern, but to regain control. He called Maria, who, true to our friendship, pretended to know nothing. He called distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Each dead end increased his frustration. The universe, it seems, has a sense of poetic irony. That very week, he had the final meeting to close the biggest deal of his career, a merger that would put him in another league of wealth. The main investor was an older man, a billionaire from a Texas family who had built his empire on values of loyalty and family tradition. During a dinner at the mansion to seal the deal, the investor, an affable man named Mr. Thompson, remarked, "Julian, I hear your mother lives with you. I'd love to say hello. I always say that a man who honors his roots is a man you can trust." The panic in Julian's eyes was almost imperceptible, but to those who knew him, it was a tsunami. He stammered an excuse, saying I was unwell and resting. Mr. Thompson accepted the excuse, but a small seed of doubt was planted. The absence of my resident ghost, the piece of rustic authenticity he used as a prop, suddenly became a dangerous liability, a crack in his impeccable facade. Weeks of tense silence passed. I moved from the hotel to a small rented apartment, using a portion of my savings. I began to establish a simple routine: morning walks, visits to the library, phone calls with Maria. And then, the call from David, my lawyer, came. The oil company had responded. As we had predicted, the last thing they wanted was a public scandal. The story of a multi-billion-dollar corporation that, decades ago, potentially deceived a young widow would be a public relations nightmare. They didn't admit guilt, of course. Their letter spoke of resolving an old property title discrepancy to avoid protracted litigation. They were offering a settlement. When David told me the amount, I had to sit down. It wasn't the billions of dollars that Julian's greed might have imagined in a lawsuit, but it was a sum that, to me, seemed astronomical. It was enough to guarantee me security, comfort, and above all, independence for the rest of my life, with plenty to spare. I didn't cry with joy. I didn't shout in triumph. What I felt was a deep, calm sense of validation. It was the universe, telling me that I was not wrong. The money was not the prize. It was the tool. It was the key that would open the last door of my cage and allow me to fly away, forever. It was justice, not in an explosion, but in a silent, dignified check. My first big decision with the money was not to buy a luxury car or jewelry. It was to buy a plane ticket back to Fresno, back home. With Maria's help, I found the perfect place. A small ground-floor apartment in a quiet community for seniors, with a sunny patio large enough for a few tomato pots and an herb garden. It was modest, but it was mine. The process of decorating my new home was a joy I hadn't felt in a long time. I bought a large, comfortable armchair, perfect for reading. I filled the shelves with my books, and on the main wall of the living room, I hung the photo of Robert, no longer hidden in a suitcase, but occupying the place of honor. Every object was chosen for its comfort and meaning, not for its brand or price. One day, as I was on my patio, planting my tomato seedlings under the hot California sun, my hands dirty with soil, I felt a happiness so pure and simple, it took my breath away. I was home. I was free. My life was no longer defined by someone else's cold opulence, but by the warm wealth of my own choices. In Scottsdale, the wealth continued to grow, but happiness was a scarce resource. Julian and Amelia lived in their mansion, which now seemed emptier and quieter than ever. The absence of my submissive presence left a vacuum they didn't know how to fill. The news of my financial settlement, which inevitably reached their ears through third parties, was the final offense. To them, it was inconceivable that I had achieved it without him, that I had refused to let him control the situation. My independence was a direct insult to his ego. I imagined their dinners, no longer filled with showing off for guests, but with a tense silence, broken only by the clinking of silver cutlery. The luxury mansion had become what I always knew it was, a mausoleum for a loveless marriage and a disconnected family. Amelia's opulence, her silk dresses and diamond jewelry, could not fill the void in her home and in her heart. They had a house, but I, in my small apartment with a patio, had a home. They were the personification of the paradox: to possess the whole world and have nothing that truly mattered. The final blow for Julian was not the loss of my control or the money he thought belonged to him. It was the loss of the deal of a lifetime. Mr. Thompson, the investor, was a meticulous man. Julian's excuse about my indisposition did not satisfy him. He did his own discreet investigations. He found out about my abrupt departure, about the rumors of a falling out. He discovered the truth not about the mineral rights, but about Julian's character. A week before signing the contract, he canceled the deal. His explanation, sent through a lawyer, was short and devastating. We do not do business with men who do not value family. For Julian, that was the apocalypse. The financial loss was immense, but the blow to his pride was fatal. He was weighed, measured, and found wanting, not as a businessman, but as a man. That night, Alone in his gigantic office, surrounded by all the symbols of his success, he finally broke. He cried. But they were not tears for the loss of money. They were the tears of a man who had climbed to the top of the mountain only to find that he was completely alone, that in his blind pursuit of everything, he had lost the one thing that mattered, the unconditional love of his mother. Today, my world is small, but my heart is vast. My mornings are filled with the smell of fresh coffee and the warmth of the sun on my small patio. My afternoons are for reading, tending to my plants, and talking with Maria. My nights are peaceful. Sometimes, I catch my reflection in the glass of the living room window, and it takes me a moment to recognize myself. The woman staring back at me does not have the stooped shoulders of resignation. Her eyes are no longer clouded by silent pain. She looks older, yes, the lines on her face tell the whole story now, not just the sad part. But she looks at peace. She looks whole. She is the woman I was always meant to be. The wealth I have now cannot be deposited in a bank or displayed at a party. It is the wealth of knowing who I am, of respecting myself, and of having control over my own destiny. Today, I don't have the luxury I had in my son's house, but I have respect, and that no one can take from me again. Have you ever done a kind gesture that changed someone's life? Leave a heart in the comments if you also believe that love is worth more than any wealth. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of second chances. Comment, "Love has no price," if you also believe in human kindness.